Hello? Okay. Thank you very much. I want to call to order this ad hoc meeting and introduce my colleagues so that they can have a chance to introduce themselves and make some comments. First of all, I want to thank Sun Creek Board of Supervisors for their hospitality and letting us their meeting room, and their staff being so generous in terms of time and helping us arrange all this. Mr. Supervisors, if you're here, sir, thank you very, very much. I appreciate it a lot, and we're very grateful for that. Also, the Fresh Produce Association for hosting us, and the Port Authority as well for being generous hosts to myself and the members of Congress that were with us. This is our second visit. We were in Mr. Vela's district in Brownsville. The opportunity to talk about the borderlands, talk about the complexity and the needs of the borderlands in relation to the discussion that is going on at a national level regarding immigration reform, where that's at, and more importantly, where do the borderlands, ports of entry, and the communities and areas surrounding the borderlands fit into that discussion. In the past, all of us individually and collectively have felt that point of view, that perspective was not on the table, that it was not being heard, and the discussion was very pointedly about enforcement and security, not about economics, not about humanitarian relief, not about what we do to enhance the economic security of the region, but the definition of security was narrow, and that's all we talked about, politically and in terms of legislation. The Senate has a bill that they passed, which added an unbelievable amount of billions of dollars to the issue of security, which all of us here individually and collectively question as the right strategy for dealing with the border, dealing with security. And as we go forward, the House of Representatives continues, because of lack of leadership at the top, have any real movement on legislation that could be taken to conference, could be negotiated, and with that process, hopefully something better, more lasting, more humane could come out of the process. We continue to be encouraged by the fact that the public in general wants something done, something common sense, something humane. We continue to be encouraged by the fact that the border caucus, which was morbid for many years, and thanks to the infusion of new members, 2 of them being with me here today, has come back to life. And we have felt that the border caucus, 11 of us who represent the southern border, our districts touch those areas, have a role in the discussion, and that's why we're doing these series of hearings. That's why we've conducted a variety of public, not only press conferences, but briefings in DC to begin to educate our colleagues and the public in general that there is some depth and some complexity to the discussion of immigration reform, and particularly with regards to the borderlands. We have invited a distinguished group of people to provide testimony today that will be part of the congressional record, and we intend to make it part of the overall discussion. And before I introduce them, I want to introduce my 2 colleagues. Let me begin on my right, but not necessarily. Congressman O'Rourke, representing El Paso and representing a very important district in this country, and has added a great deal of leadership and energy and intellect to all these discussions that we're consumed with right now. And very happy to call him a colleague and very happy to be working with him. Today he was in Nogales. What hotel were you staying at? Forget. Anyway, but see, Beto being young and healthy decided to go for a jog. And he jogged into the whole Mariposa where they're building the new park and almost got tased by a series of customs and border patrol agents this morning. And it was an inadvertent welcome to Nogales, but he survived. With that, and I have to tell the story because it's going to last for a while. I want to introduce a gentleman that from Texas that represents the El Paso area for any comments he may have. Mr. Rourke.
Thank you. I also want to thank the Board of Supervisors for hosting the hearing that we're having today. And I want to thank the community of Nogales for your hospitality and commend you on what is truly a beautiful community. I got in last night, I looked up, I was at the Candlewood Suites, and in driving in, I passed the outdoor soccer complex, the walled complex. We don't have one of those in El Paso, and watched part of the game taking place there. It was beautiful, a beautiful night, and wonderful to see so many families out. The level of athleticism was really impressive. Got to bed early, woke up early, went for a run, thought I'd go see the port of entry myself, and there were no signs saying don't go into this area of the inspection station, so I took that as an invitation to do some on-the-field exploration, and I want to tell you, your CBP officers are very vigilant here. They ran me down and ensured that I was not a threat to the homeland, and released me, but in a very professional way, so I want to thank them also. And I want to tell you that and you already know this, but in Congressman Grijalva, you really have somebody who's very special in the Congress. As you know, and in many cases, I think we're going to be speaking to the choir today, but many other members don't understand the value of the border, the incredibly positive dynamic that we represent to our country's economy, to our country's culture, to communities like Nogales and El Paso, not to mention communities throughout the country. But far too often we focus as a country on threats at the border. Congressmen like myself and Congressman Vela will talk about economic opportunities measured in jobs and economic growth. Congressman Grijalva is really unique in bringing the focus down to the human element of the border, the people who actually cross, the people who live here, the people whose lives are affected by the policy that is made in Washington, D.C., and he is helping to shape that policy for the better through education of our colleagues. And so I want to publicly commend him for doing that and for bringing Congressman Vela and myself here. He'll be joining us in El Paso on Monday, so we look forward to having him there. Let me say a couple of very, very quick things. I was born and raised in El Paso, Texas. Along with Ciudad Juarez, we represent the largest binational community in the world, and I mean the largest true binational community. Our street grids connect to each other. We've been described as two communities joined at the hip, separated or joined by the Rio Grande River that typically doesn't have much of any water in it, and 5 border crossings in the county of El Paso between those two communities, 6 million crossings a year, $92 billion in U.S.-Mexico trade. In my community of 800,000 people, 100,000 jobs depend on that cross-border activity. The Juarezans who come in and shop in our stores spend over $1.5 billion every year. The trade volume, you can tell how impressive it is. But beyond that, into the efforts that Congressman Grijalva has led, those are families that live on both sides of the border, brothers and sisters, employees, students, colleagues, people who share one valley, one river, one true binational community. And part of what inspired me to run for Congress last year was the frustration at seeing perhaps well-intentioned but misguided and ill-informed national policy disproportionately affect communities like Nogales and El Paso and San Diego and Brownsville, which, by the way, are the safest communities in the United States. El Paso, Texas is the safest community 3 years running. To see these policies affect us so negatively in terms of our economic opportunities, quality of life, and capitalizing on this wonderful, beautiful relationship that we have with Mexico. So I'm very interested in hearing the testimony today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. And again, I want to thank you for your hospitality and for the leadership you have in your member of Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Rourke. Appreciate it. Take time to introduce another value. What changed in the Board of Caucus is that we have, out of 11, I think 5, 6 freshmen, new members. And that energy and that focus had been missing terribly. And I think a great deal of the revival of that caucus and the fact that it has some status now, and it didn't in the past, is in great part due to the new members that have joined the caucus. And one of them, the co-chair of the Board of Caucus, is my friend Mr. Vela from Texas. We were hosted by him in Brownsville. I missed the cookout because I was coming back, you know, and I missed the other fun things that happened. But what I did get to do is to share time with my colleagues, but also to the public meeting that we had in Brownsville. And for me, it echoed a lot of the things that I've heard here, that you hear in other parts of the border, and come to the realization that we have more in common than we have in differences. And so I want to thank him for that, and I want to thank him for his leadership in reviving this border caucus that I think is going to be a force to be reckoned with, not only through this issue, but through future issues. And without further ado, let me introduce my the gentleman from Texas, my friend, Mr. Congressman Vela from Brownsville, sir.
Thank you. I too would like to thank Congressman Grijalva and the Board of Supervisors and everybody that is here with us today for inviting us to Arizona. We share a lot of things as residents of the border, but by the same token, every border area has its distinctions. So for that reason, we as members of the Border Caucus thought that it would be important for us to see each other's districts, to talk to people in each other's districts, because with every discussion and every experience talking to people who live the border life, we would all learn something and take something back home. You're sitting before 3 members of Congress who, from the standpoint of immigration reform, and Congressman O'Rourke and myself, of course, are 2 of the newer members of Congress. And as we entered this session, immigration reform was, of course, a topic that was supposed to be front and center. But before you, I think, sit 3 people who believe in 3 basic things: that when we talk about immigration reform, that what we need is a clean pathway to citizenship or legalization, depending on how one would define it. I'm sure we need safe and secure border security measures, but that they need to be rational. And we all have our different opinions. That's the thing about Congress, because there's 435 people. I tell people back home, it'd be easy to pass a law if Congress was a body of 1. But when there's 434 other members, you're bound to have different opinions. And it's my belief that yes, we need sound border security policy, and we've passed not a perfect piece of legislation through the Homeland Security Committee, but something a whole lot more rational than what we saw in the Senate border security bill. But it's my personal belief that to the extent we need border security, that the pathways to citizenship should not be conditioned upon border security. Now, we'll see how that goes. But I think the most important part of the equation that we brought to light is that when we talk about immigration reform, when we talk about pathways to citizenship, and we talked about border security, that what has been missing in that debate is the issue of border trade. And three of us and those who are other members of the Border Caucus have hopefully shed some light on that. And when the Senate bill came out, there were those of us who were adamantly opposed to the border search provisions, will remain so in a very vigilant fashion. And I'm hoping that our voice was able to put a stop to what we saw as some really, really bad provisions. But again, thank you for having us, and I look forward as well to hearing from some of our friends that are on the panel before us.
Yeah, the problem when you start introductions at the beginning of something, you look in the audience and you invariably know that you missed somebody, and then it builds up a lot of resentment as the day goes through, and I certainly don't want that. But I do want to, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge and recognize the mayor of Nogales. Sir, thank you very much for being there. I appreciate it. And I don't know if anyone comes and the two council members. There we are. Thank you, all of them. And with that, let me begin. We'll do left to right this time. We have a distinguished group of witnesses. Some of them have testified in DC at hearings that we've had, and I appreciate that very much. I do remember that we had a hearing on the effects of the security policy and enforcement policy on border communities and on residents, and it was very, very timely, very good. I would have hoped that more people would have paid attention to it. Various studies have come out recently that have even shared more light on what is going on in the border, and one of the organizations that's been responsible for leading a very compassionate but very strong enforcement advocacy in behalf of border communities and immigrants and people on both sides of the borders has been the Kino Initiative. And with us today is a gentleman that I got to work with early on, and Sean Carroll from the Kino Border Initiative. We have had the pleasure of working with him, and my colleagues here have also had the pleasure of working with him, and we look forward as this whole discussion on immigration and immigration reform in the borderlands continues, that he will be a presence at those discussions as well. With that, sir, let me turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Congressman Grijalva, and thank you, Congressman O'Rourke and Congressman Vela, and for the presence of the distinguished guests here at this hearing today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to testify on the humanitarian crisis afflicting the region many of us call home, the U.S.-Mexico border. I'm grateful to you for holding this ad hoc committee hearing on the border, where the realities of border communities, immigration, and security are far more nuanced than is understood in Washington, D.C. And as border congressman, I'm sure you share that sentiment. I'd like to begin by talking about an experience shared by Ms. Peg Bowden, a member of the Green Valley Samaritans in southern Arizona, who volunteers every Tuesday morning at the Kino Border Initiative's Aid Center for Deported Migrants in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. On May 28, 2012, she wrote a blog about Alfonso, a migrant she had met at our center, who had arrived after being deported to Tijuana. He had severely blistered feet due to crossing from Mexico into the United States through the desert. He had lived in Vista, California with his wife and 5 children. Due to his deep desire to be reunited with his family and to provide a better life for them, he made that painful and difficult decision to enter the United States without documents. After a day in the desert, he could not keep up and his companion Isaac walked to a place where he could contact the Border Patrol. When the Border Patrol arrived to arrest Isaac, he urged the agents to go find Alfonso, and he told them that he could direct them to him. Despite his pleas, the Border Patrol did not search for Alfonso until 5 days later, when, with the help of Isaac, they found his severely decomposed body near Cabo Kibari, the sacred mountain for the Tohono O'odham people. A human being whom she had met and assisted a short time before was now yet another migrant who had died along the U.S.-Mexico border. We who live along the border have watched the failure to pass comprehensive immigration reform, while our government officials increase militarization of our communities, which results in people perishing in the desert, people like Alfonso, as they take more perilous journeys into more remote border regions. Economic devastation, family separation, generalized violence literally drive people north as they desperately seek a place where they can work and live with dignity. Our failure to address these root causes of migration has led to around 70,000 reported disappearances of migrants in Mexico since 2006, and to the deaths of an estimated 2,038 people since 2001. Deaths have also not only taken place in the desert, but literally right along the border wall, near the Nogales port of entry. Last October, 16-year-old Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez, a resident of Nogales, Sonora, was shot and killed by a U.S. Border Patrol agent, just a short walk away from the port of entry between Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora. This incident is one of 20 that have taken place in the past 2 years involving lethal use of force by Border Patrol agents. It is almost a year since Jose Antonio's death, and yet the U.S. Border Patrol and the Department of Justice have provided no information on the investigation taking place. Frequent calls for justice have fallen on deaf ears. At the same time as migrants make it through the desert alive, they frequently fall victim to abuses perpetrated by organized crime. I recall one woman in our shelter who had left her 2 daughters in Guatemala to come to the U.S. so she could pay their school tuition, so they could have a better life. After being led into the desert by 2 guides, she was beaten repeatedly across the knees and then raped by them. Left for dead, she wandered in the desert until she was rescued by the U.S. Border Patrol and eventually deported to Nogales, Sonora. Numerous women in our shelter share with us stories of the verbal, physical, and sexual abuse they have suffered while crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. While some migrants share with us stories of good treatment and of rescues by the U.S. Border Patrol, all too frequently, numerous migrants complain to us of mistreatment by them. In our February 2013 report entitled Undocumented Failures, 24.8% of the almost 5,000 migrants we surveyed from March to August 2012 complained of being a victim of abuse by U.S. Border Patrol, verbal insults and physical abuse when they were arrested in the desert and when they were detained. As an example, about a month ago, a 16-year-old young man was in the desert with his mother and brother. When the Border Patrol found him in a bush, the agent struck him 3 times in the head with the butt of his gun, causing the young man to bleed, even though he was not resisting arrest. Unfortunately, from migrants' testimonies, we know that this kind of behavior, which chips away at the self-respect of both the migrant and the one who abuses, is distressingly common. Since oversight and accountability mechanisms are woefully inadequate, so abuses are almost never addressed. Other migrants tell us about being detained in cold cells, in crowded conditions, and without adequate access to food and medication. When some migrants are released from detention, their belongings are not returned to them. They then suddenly find themselves in a Mexican border city without money, adequate clothing, or their identification card, making access to services almost impossible, and providing incentive to risk crossing the border again. If they are deported at night, their vulnerability increases exponentially, since they have been repatriated to an unfamiliar border city and are easy targets for abuse and exploitation by organized crime and human smugglers. On August 28th of this year, our nation observed the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and of Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. This event and his timeless words remind us that we here too have a powerful dream. We here too have a powerful vision that our border region will become a thriving community where human rights and dignity will be respected, where people will not be profiled for their race and ethnicity, where people who migrate to our country will be welcomed and will have the opportunity to offer their gifts and talents which strengthen and bring life to the United States. I believe that the following policy recommendations will help us move forward in making this vision a reality. In order to address irregular migration and the humanitarian toll associated with unauthorized border crossings, reform the visa system to make more visas available to unite family members who are separated because of their immigration status. Amend Customs and Border Protection's use of force policy to prevent the deaths of migrants and border residents. When lethal incidents do occur, investigate what happened in a prompt and transparent manner to build community trust. Create community-based structures that ensure accountability of Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement to local border communities. And consult non-governmental organizations on both sides of the border about available services when developing new deportation practices and protocols. Do not separate families during deportation. Do not deport migrants in the middle of the night, or deport migrants to faraway ports of entry, as all these practices put migrants at extreme risk and make it easier for them to be identified and victimized by human traffickers. Adopt standards for Customs and Border Protection short-term custody facilities, and always return migrants' belongings before deportation. The Spanish poet Antonio Machado once wrote, "Traveler, there is no path. The path is made by walking it. Caminante no hay camino. Se hace camino al andar." Through our presence in this hearing today, we continue to create this difficult but important path of just and humane immigration reform. May God give us the courage and strength we need to stay on this path of border revitalization and to make it a reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Father. Let me now introduce Mr. James Lyle, ACLU of Arizona. James currently conducts litigation and advocacy related to civil and human rights violation in the U.S.-Mexico border region. He joined the ACLU as a staff attorney in December of 2011. He has been involved in much civil rights litigation, including immigrant rights and prisoner rights docket. A former Georgetown law fellow at the Esperanza Immigrant Rights Project in Los Angeles, and subsequently as in Kids in Youth Defense and law fellow He specializes in taking care of those unaccompanied immigrant children in state and federal court proceedings. James was a volunteer with No More Deaths in Tucson, where he co-authored The Culture of Cruelty, a report documenting widespread border patrol abuse along the U.S.-Mexico border. It's my pleasure to welcome him here and turn the time over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Grijalva. My name is James Duff-Lyle. I'm a staff attorney at the ACLU of Arizona, where I work in the ACLU's Border Litigation Project. I want to thank the Congressman for organizing this hearing and this series of hearings, for giving the ACLU the opportunity to be here to discuss civil and human rights violations along the U.S. border and the experiences of border residents who are all too often left out of the public debate on immigration reform. Immigration reform proposals have generally assumed the continued expansion of U.S. Customs and Border Protection and additional border enforcement measures are a necessary component of reform. However, these proposals have largely ignored the experiences of border communities, including the reality that the southwest border is already heavily militarized at great expense to taxpayers, and abuses by U.S. immigration officials are widespread. Meanwhile, border apprehensions are at a 40-year low, while crossing deaths are at historic highs. In this context, proposals to dump billions of additional taxpayer dollars into misguided border security initiatives are a recipe for further waste and abuse. In southern Arizona, it has become increasingly common for the ACLU to receive complaints from both citizens and non-citizens reporting civil rights violations by CBP officials. These include the following general areas, discussed in greater detail in the comments that were submitted prior to this hearing. Ports of entry. The ACLU has received numerous complaints from citizens and lawful residents who have suffered abuse at U.S. and Arizona ports of entry. In May of last year, the ACLU submitted a complaint on behalf of 11 individuals who experienced extreme mistreatment at ports of entry along the southwest border. It included accounts of unprovoked assaults and verbal abuse, unwarranted use of handcuffs and shackles, extended and recurring detentions, invasive searches, property destruction, and a denial of food, water, and legal representation. More than a year later, DHS has yet to respond to the allegations in 8 of the 11 cases reported. Vehicle checkpoints. CBP operates 11 vehicle checkpoints in Arizona, the majority of them more than 25 miles north of the border and in close proximity to residential areas. In some towns, border residents must pass through checkpoints multiple times every day to run errands, buy groceries, or take children to school. The ACLU has received numerous reports of border residents subjected to unlawful vehicle searches, extended detention, property damage, threats, and physical abuse at Border Patrol checkpoints. Multiple individuals have reported being informed by agents that they, quote, have no rights at checkpoints. Roving patrols. Although the Border Patrol must have a reasonable suspicion of an immigration violation to make a vehicle stop, in practice, Border Patrol agents are pulling over Arizona motorists without such reasonable suspicion. In many cases, these stops occur far from the border, where Border Patrol is much less likely to have a valid reason to believe any immigration violation has occurred. In May of this year, Clarissa Christensen, a Tucson area resident, reported being stopped by agents approximately 60 miles north of the border as she was returning home with her young children from school. When she demanded to know the reason she'd been stopped, agents threatened her with a taser, threatened to cut her out of a seatbelt with a knife, slashed her tire, and left her and her children with a flat tire on a remote desert road. Trespassing. Equally disturbing are documented reports of landowners whose properties are intruded upon by Border Patrol. While CBP claims authority to enter onto private lands within 25 miles of the border, the ACLU has received numerous reports of agents unlawfully entering property more than 25 miles from the border, in some cases causing property damage and even detaining landowners on their own land. A recent op-ed in the New York Times profiled a Motto, Arizona rancher Stuart Lowe, who was detained on his ranch while agents demanded that he provide identification. Racial profiling in collaboration with local law enforcement. Complaints arising out of Border Patrol collaboration with local law enforcement through state and federal programs including Operation Stone Garden, Secure Communities, as well as Arizona's SB 1070 are also common. The ACLU has documented numerous complaints of Arizona residents stopped on a pretext and detained solely for the purpose of investigating legal status. Such practices are unconstitutional, and as many police officials have recognized, these policies endanger public safety by diverting limited funds from legitimate police priorities and spreading fear and distrust of law enforcement in immigrant communities. Short-term custody. No form of CBP abuse has been documented more thoroughly than the consistent abuse of immigrants in short-term Border Patrol custody. In the past 3 years alone, no fewer than 6 separate groups, including the Keno Border Initiative, have released reports documenting systemic abuses and inhumane detention conditions, from routine denial of food, water, and medical care, to extreme overcrowding, use of severe temperatures, permanent confiscation of personal property, and physical and verbal abuse. Due process. The ACLU also regularly documents due process violations by CBP and other immigration officials. These include the denial of access to counsel, the confiscation of legal documents, including valid visas, and the practice of coercing individuals otherwise eligible for immigration relief into signing voluntary departure orders. Additional due process concerns arise in the context of expanding federal prosecutions of immigrants on entry and re-entry charges, including Operation Streamline, in which large groups of immigrants are tried en masse without being afforded meaningful legal representation. These prosecutions offend fundamental principles of due process and have threatened to overwhelm the federal court system while transferring billions of taxpayer dollars to the private prison industry. Excessive use of force. Since January 2010, at least 20 individuals have died as the result of alleged excessive use of force by CBP officials, including 7 minors under 21, 5 U.S. citizens, 8 individuals alleged to be throwing rocks, and 6 individuals killed while on the Mexican side of the border. Agents have rarely faced prosecution for using lethal force. CBP is now the largest law enforcement agency in the country, claiming extra constitutional authority over vast stretches of territory far removed from the border. And yet it lacks effective oversight and accountability mechanisms and has failed to adopt law enforcement best practices successfully used by law enforcement agencies across the country to reduce abuse and complaints. We offer the following general recommendations, again in greater detail in the submitted comments, to prevent further abuse and ensure a more transparent and accountable agency. 1, increase CBP oversight, accountability, and transparency mechanisms. 2, implement policies for preventing excessive use of force incidents. 3, implement policies to address the epidemic of border crossing deaths. 4, issue enforceable CBP short-term custody standards and appropriately inspect detention facilities. 5, discourage state and local police involvement in immigration enforcement. 6, stop wasteful federal prosecutions of entry-related offenses. And 7, reduce CBP's zone of operations from 100 miles from the border down to 25 miles from the border. Congress must listen to the voices of border communities and address systemic Border Patrol abuse and impunity rather than compounding these problems further. To be clear, the border is already heavily militarized, with devastating consequences for the constitutional rights of border residents. At a time when migrant apprehensions are lower than at any time since the 1970s, and complaints of abuse are on the rise, wasteful spending and misguided enforcement measures must be reined in. The time for comprehensive immigration reform is long overdue. However, we must also work to ensure that U.S. immigration officials operate in a manner that is consistent with our laws and values. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Let me now introduce Mr. Christopher Wilson of Woodrow Wilson Center. He's an associate at the Mexican Institute with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where he develops the Institute's research and programming on regional economic integration and U.S.-Mexico affairs. He is the author of Working Together, Economic Ties Between the United States and Mexico, Wilson Center 2011. Co-author of the State of the Border Report, an excellent report, the Wilson Center 2013. He is regularly consulted by national and international media outlets regarding U.S.-Mexico relations, has written numerous op-ed columns for a variety of major news outlets, and he continues to provide to all policymakers, the center and himself, a breadth and a depth of information that is sorely missing in this whole discussion. With that, the floor is yours, Mr. Wilson. Thank you.
Congressman Grijalva, Congressman Vela, Congressman O'Rourke, thank you for this opportunity to address the important issue of U.S.-Mexico trade in the context of the current immigration reform debate. Though all too often hidden from the public eye behind headlines on organized crime, violence, and unauthorized immigration, the United States-Mexico economic relationship is strong and growing. Since the 1990s, the scale of the economic relationship has grown enormously as the United States, Mexico, and Canada have joined together to become a tightly integrated market and production platform. In fact, U.S.-Mexico goods and services trade is now valued at more than $500 billion per year. Exports to Mexico are now more than U.S. exports to Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the so-called BRICS, combined. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimates that U.S.-Mexico trade supports 6 million American jobs each year. That's throughout the U.S., not just in the border region. But in addition to being immense, U.S. trade with Mexico is also unique. We not only trade finished goods, but we actually work together to build products, sending parts back and forth across the border several times during the course of manufacturing. Because of this phenomenon, imports of final goods from Mexico contain, on average, 40% U.S. content. Imports from Mexico, unlike imports from any other country except Canada, strongly promote U.S. exports, industry, and jobs. For each dollar spent buying imports from Mexico, that means 40 cents of it stays right here in the United States. As a point of comparison, imports from China contain just 4% U.S. parts. The unique nature of U.S.-Mexico trade means that our nations are best understood as partners working together on the global stage, not as competitors where a gain in one country represents a loss in the other. In addition to profoundly linking together the U.S. and Mexican economies, the system of production sharing, with parts going back and forth across the border multiple times as products are being manufactured, creates a multiplier effect for any inefficiencies at the border. Having trucks full of goods wait in line for hours at the border before being able to cross is expensive once, but manufacturers involved in co-manufacturing in Mexico often have to pay what is essentially a border tax multiple times. Unfortunately, the infrastructure and capacity of the ports of entry to process goods and individuals entering the United States has not kept pace with the expansion of bilateral trade or the population growth of the border region. Instead, the need for greater border security following the terrorist attacks of 9/11 led to a thickening of the border, dividing of the twin cities that characterize the region, and adding costly, long, and unpredictable wait times for commercial and individual crossers alike. Congestion acts as a drag on the competitiveness of the region and of the United States and Mexico in their entirety. Given the importance of our nation's security and economic needs, solutions are needed that strengthen both border security and efficiency at the same time. The development of the 21st Century Border Initiative, which was recently reaffirmed by Presidents Peña Nieto and Obama, takes steps in this direction, but the efforts need to be redoubled. Moderate investments to update infrastructure and to fully staff the ports of entry are certainly needed, as long lines and overworked staff promote neither efficiency nor security. But in a time of tight federal budgets, more resources cannot be the only answer. Strategic efforts to maximize existing resources, improving throughput, and reducing congestion are also needed. For the past 2 decades, border security efforts along the U.S.-Mexico border have focused on the areas between official crossing points. As a result, the Border Patrol is now 5 times larger than it was in the early 1990s, yet much less attention has been paid to the staffing, infrastructure, and technology needs of the ports of entry themselves, both leaving them less secure and undermining America's economic competitiveness. In the context of immigration reform, a continued focus on the areas between the ports of entry and inattention to the security and efficiency needs of the official ports of entry could exacerbate this issue. U.S. Customs and Border Protection has identified a need for $6 billion in border infrastructure investments to fully modernize the ports of entry along the U.S.-Mexico border. Inadequate infrastructure currently causes long lineups at the border, which in addition to their economic impacts outlined above, encourage officials to rush the screening process and possibly miss suspicious crossers, while increasing the risk that drugs or other illegal goods be planted in idle vehicles. Finally, rather than conditioning immigration reform on border security, reform of the legal immigration system could be used as a tool to strengthen border security and efficiency. Border security funding associated with the reform effort could be used to address deficiencies at the ports of entry, and reform of the visa system itself could act to limit illegal immigration. When visa demand is much greater than visa supply, prospective immigrants are more likely to cross illegally. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me now introduce a friend, Jennifer Allen, who joined the League of Conservation Voters as the Latino Outreach Program Director nationally this April, and to expand the League's Latino support in fighting real issues like climate change. Prior to being with LCV, for 10 years, Jennifer was the founding executive director of the Border Action Network. She led many successful state and national policy campaigns, developed a lot of hundreds of grassroots leaders in Arizona and other parts of the Southwest in the immigrant community. I think this experience, plus her experience in economic and community development, are going to serve the League of Conservation Voters well, and the environmental issues that we face on the border well. And with that, let me introduce my friend, Ms. Allen.
Thank you. I first want to thank Congressman Grijalva for the invitation and opportunity to speak to you all today, and for his extraordinary leadership and representation for communities in Southern Arizona. I also want to thank Congressman Vela, Congressman O'Rourke, for taking the time to visit Arizona border communities and hear directly from those who call the border region home. Indeed, one of the greatest travesties and omissions in Washington's discussion of the U.S.-Mexico border is the gross misunderstandings and misrepresentations of the region. More than 6 million people call the U.S. side of the U.S.-Mexico border home. Whether we're in Nogales, El Paso, or Brownsville, we have family here. We go to school, we go to church, go to the grocery store, we greet our neighbors, we walk our children to a neighborhood park. We hunt in the hills outside Douglas, or we will go bird watching at the San Pedro River near Sierra Vista, or picnic at Patagonia Lake. We live here because we love the unique cultural vibrancy and because of the Sonora Desert's profound beauty. However, the very things that border communities value and depend on are the very things that are being utterly destroyed and undermined by border enforcement's reliance on military-style tactics and disregard for the rule of law. Today I'm highlighting 3 of those key impacts: on wildlife habitat, on cultural and historic sites, and from the Corker-Hoven provisions in Senate Bill 744, and I'll conclude with a couple of key recommendations. First, on the impacts of current border enforcement on wildlife habitat. One of the most profound impacts from current border enforcement in the Sonoran Desert has been on wildlife and their habitat. Endangered and protected species, like the last few remaining North American jaguar, stately bighorn sheep, Sonoran pronghorn, desert tortoise, and dozens of others have had their habitat dissected by walls. Their migratory routes have been utterly blocked, and access to mates, water, and food has been limited. As part of the 2005 Real ID Act, the Secretary of Homeland Security has the power to waive all legal requirements to ensure the ease of construction of barriers and roads. The Congressional Research Service has characterized this provision as providing for the largest waiver of law in American history. Since 2005, waivers have been invoked 5 times, eliminating 37 local, state, and federal laws, including the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. Yet, as we all know, rules and laws are put in place for a reason, be it to keep our air clean, our water healthy, or to protect places important to our cultural and historic heritage. The waiving of laws in the border region has not only caused damage to wildlife and places of cultural and historic importance, but the lack of checks and balances laws provide has in fact undermined Border Patrol's own infrastructure, with walls toppling over and roads washing away during normal flooding events, due to poor engineering and lack oversight that could have been prevented had the waivers not been exercised. Second, the disturbance and destruction of protected cultural and historic sites. Among the laws that the Department of Homeland Security has waived under its existing authority are the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. Testifying before Congress on the impacts of the border wall, Chairman Ned Norris Jr. of the Lenape Nation said, and I quote, "Our land is now cut in half, with Occan communities, sacred sites, salt pilgrimage routes, and families divided." Chairman Norris went on to state that, quote, "Fragments of human remains were observed in the tire tracks of heavy construction equipment. Barriers in the border road now cross that site. Imagine a bulldozer parking in your family graveyard, turning up the bones. This is our reality." Unquote. Third, and on the possible effects of the Corker-Hogan Border Security Provision. With the Senate's inclusion of Corker and Hogan's Border Security Amendment in S-744, the border faces an even more disturbing horizon. With the prospect of doubling the number of border agents from 20,000 to nearly 40,000, we anticipate even greater degradation of the fragile borderlands from Border Patrol's additional patrols. The amendment broadens DHS's waiver of laws rather than narrowing or making it more specific as it should, to include construction of other physical tactical infrastructure that would include things like forward operating bases, towers, heliopads, or airports, for example. Waiving laws and regulations jeopardize public health, the safety of border communities, and the integrity and viability of our diverse desert lands. Furthermore, the amendment includes the creation of a separate southern border fencing strategy and directs $1.5 billion to double the length of border wall from its current 700 to 1,400 miles. Walls are the most costly. In fact, the GAO report reports that walls average $6.5 million per mile. Walls are the most damaging to wildlife and habitat and have been demonstrated to be the least effective of the security tools employed by DHS. Recommendations. In 2012, the U.S. spent $18 billion on immigration and border enforcement, more than all other federal law enforcement combined. In defending our country's territorial integrity, we need not eliminate one of the pillars of this country's character, that we are a nation of laws. No agency should be encouraged to operate outside of the law, especially law enforcement agencies. Moreover, our community's fundamental values and respect and dependence on clean air, clean water, preserving places of cultural and historic importance, and keeping our desert alive, vibrant, and teeming with the richness and diversity it depends on, should not be sacrificed to budgets fixated on strategies that have not proven successful to even their own goals. Our recommendations are simple. First, end the use of waiving laws and regulations on the border. Second, border security must comply with the National Environmental Policy Act and its requirements to assess impacts on border communities and the environment and seek the least damaging option. 3, consult with border communities and other stakeholders to ensure that in the name of the defense of our nation, we're also defending the health, the safety, and the environment of those on its borders. Thank you.
Just a side note, when the discussion of 50 or 100 mile radius for the waiving of laws was going on, inadvertently the author of the legislation put the whole country down. Canada, the East Coast shoreline, Louisiana shoreline, Florida, up to California. Everybody went crazy, screaming. Thing was sure to be defeated. And then magically it came down just to the southwest border. And I remember my people that were adamant about the southwest border having the waiver and codifying that waiver into law were also equally as adamant on the floor, saying that how dare you have this kind of a law on the eastern shoreline. I wonder, Well, I just thought I'd point that out. Allison Moore, Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs for the Fresh Produce Association of the Americas, an organization that I have worked with since I got into office. We've had some very, pardon the pun, fruitful, I can't help myself. We've had some good things that have come about, particularly working on the port of entry issue and expansion. We've had our frustrations, and I think part of the lack of attention to what goes on in the border. Alice and her association, parts of the Port Authority, have been persistent, consistent advocates about the fact that you cannot ignore some of the realities that those of us that work, live, and make our businesses part of this border region have to be part of what this discussion is and what the strategy is. For that consistency, I want to thank you and the association and extend to you the opportunity to make some comments.
Thank you, Congressman Grijalva, Congressman Vela, Congressman O'Rourke. On behalf of the FPAA, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak about our shared border with Mexico, and also to thank you for coming to our community. Too often, as we all can see, when the word border is discussed, it evokes thoughts of land stretching east and west, and fences and helicopters and camera towers. And I'm here to tell you about the border that our national media and many in Congress continue to overlook. I want to talk to you about a border with vibrant ports of entry that facilitate the flow of legitimate goods and people that are the economic engine of our entire country. Ports that also function to prevent illegal goods and people from crossing as well. I'm here to tell you about the U.S. companies that rely on the efficient movement of goods that fuel our economy, one truck or one container ship or one commercial flight at a time. When the words border and security are discussed in Congress and in our public debate about the border, we must include the frank discussion about economic security as well. It's been neglected for far too long, and it has resulted in outdated infrastructure and woefully inadequate staffing for Customs and Border Protection officers that stand at our ports of entry every single day. Our members are the U.S. companies involved in importing and distributing fresh fruits and vegetables from Mexico across North America. Our members are also the U.S. box companies, seed companies, service providers, equipment builders that export all of their goods to farms across Mexico. We're the single largest port of entry for fresh produce from Mexico, crossing over 4.9 billion pounds of produce each year. The total for Mexico is 14.7 billion pounds annually. That translates into $3 billion of the $6.5 billion total for fresh produce coming from Mexico. The University of Arizona recently completed a study made possible by the Economic Development Administration looking at the economic impact of the fresh produce and manufacturing industries on Nogales and Santa Cruz County. Just to give you a snapshot of what that looks like, fresh produce and the manufacturing industries combined account for 33% of all jobs and 35% of all wages in the county. These are the largest private employing sectors in the region, with law enforcement making up a significant part of the remaining percentage. The fresh produce industry in Santa Cruz County generates $437 million in economic output, which is more than a third of the county's total economic output. The produce industry is also responsible for 4,000 jobs and $190 million in wages. Manufacturing operations in Nogales, Sonora generate $304.9 million in economic output in Santa Cruz County here in the United States, and are responsible for 1,800 U.S. jobs, which speaks to the point of manufacturing in Mexico is definitely an economic benefit for the U.S. as well. It generates jobs on both sides of the border. Our ports of entry are poised to benefit from expanding fresh produce imports from Mexico. From 2002 to 2012, produce imports grew 42%, from 8 billion pounds to more than 14 billion, and that's numbers from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Additionally, as manufacturing companies are looking at nearshoring and bringing back manufacturing processes and operations from China and other parts of Asia and locating them back in Mexico and the Western Hemisphere, that's something that we should seize on as an opportunity for our economy here in the United States. A lot of people would ask, well, why does it matter to me if I'm not from a state that borders Mexico? You know, why are our ports of entry relevant nationally? 75,200 people in Pennsylvania ship care. That's the number of jobs tied to trade with Mexico in that state alone, which is worth over $5 billion to the state. The same can be said for 64,000 people sitting in Indiana right now that have a job because of trade with Mexico, or 84,300 people in Mississippi who also have jobs that are tied directly to trade with Mexico. So whether a state grows cotton for export, builds machines, refines oil, our ports of entry drive the economy for communities just like Nogales, Arizona, all across the United States. The economy and our future growth are hampered by the significant understaffing of our ports. A report published by the University of Southern California studied the impact of delays at ports of entry on the U.S. economy. The study looked at 33 ports of entry, and to put it simply, one additional CBP officer translates into $2 million increase in GDP, $640,000 saved by reducing delays, and 33 jobs. That's a pretty significant return on investment for one CBP officer. The Mariposa Port of Entry in Nogales is undergoing a $220 million reconfiguration project, which will more than double the capacity for Arizona's largest gateway for trade and commerce. Unless significant steps are taken by Congress to address the staffing shortfalls of CBP officers, we'll be running a flagship port of entry with less than half of the screening lanes open to trade and travelers. The ports of entry in Nogales, Arizona are short approximately 250 officers at today's staffing needs. This is without the additional staffing needs we'll have when the Mariposa Port of Entry is completely open and operational. The situation is the same across ports of entry along our border. There are estimates that show CBP is understaffed by more than 3,500 officers countrywide at today's staffing needs. Discussions about the border, border security, and immigration reform must include serious solutions to the understaffing and infrastructure needs of our ports of entry. The conversation must look to our entire border, not just the miles of border stretching east to west, but also the ports of entry that facilitate legitimate people and goods that drive our economy. The ports of entry that make it possible for people to go to the grocery store and pay their rent and pay tuition for their children to go to college. The ports of entry that drive jobs and that will drive future job growth for our country. So Congressman Grijalva, members of Congress, thank you again for this opportunity, and thank you for coming to visit us in Nogales.
Thank you.
Thank you. And let me introduce someone that probably needs no introduction, Sheriff of Santa Cruz County, Sheriff Estrada. If you guys saw USA Today, he was prominently featured yesterday in an article about law enforcement and border sheriffs and law enforcement and their reaction to what's being talked about nationally in terms of additional, and not because he's like from my district, but it was the most intelligent, coherent comments that were made by Sheriff Estrada in that whole article. The other issue is that he's been elected in 1993. Sheriff is serving his 6th term. Respected in Nogales and Santa Cruz County and across the state, and very trusted liaison with both local, state, and federal agencies on both sides of the border. She's very active in a lot of numerous civic and community organizations in the county. But I think, 4 decades of law enforcement, I think merits that his point of view and his experience be listened to. It's something that experience has taught me, that someone that has toiled in this area for successfully and with a great deal of credibility brings a great deal of credibility to this issue. And with that, let me turn it over to the sheriff for any comment you may have, sir.
Thank you, Congressman O'Rourke. Vela, thank you for being here. Thanks for the opportunity to address you. And thanks for your introduction. Again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to once again address you on this topic. I feel that I am uniquely qualified, that I have spent 45 years in various law enforcement positions in and around Nogales, and currently on my 6th term as Sheriff of Santa Cruz County. I remain a bilingual, bicultural resident who came from humble beginnings to become someone who has fully realized the American dream. That being said, my first and foremost concern as Sheriff is to promote the reality that Santa Cruz County is a very safe, very secure area, especially given that we do not have a natural buffer between Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. We are literally back-to-back neighbors, which is one reason that there have been at least 100 truck tunnels discovered connecting both sides of the border, built exclusively to transport drugs and undocumented crossers. Given this reality, any immigration reform is going to impact Santa Cruz County in a major way. We are the smallest county in Arizona, sharing a border with a third world metropolitan 10 times our size, and we have fewer resources as a community than larger areas with strong tax bases. While there are aspects of the Senate bill that are concerning, overall I feel comfortable with most of the proposals. What would be most advantageous, what would be the most advantageous is the most realistic parts of the Senate bill were combined with the most advantageous provision in the representative bill. In other words, if there was a true bipartisan effort to do what is best for stakeholders, including realistic funding of personnel that secure the border, but also addressing the issue of what to do with those already here and those who will continue to come no matter what legislation is passed. It is important to remember that we in Santa Cruz County have the highest ratio of law enforcement personnel to residents in the country. Simply increasing the number even more is not a solution unless other reforms are also in place, such as the guest worker program that allows for legal and safe entry for the sole purpose of employment. Nogales and residential Santa Cruz County is merely a conduit, an area that funnels drug smugglers and undocumented to most metropolitan areas within Arizona and throughout the nation. Those who conduct the trade do not want to draw attention to themselves or bring down the rest of the law enforcement community before they reach their real destination. The crimes committed here are mostly related to property, such as shoplifting and burglary, but even those have decreased greatly over the past years. However, there are a number of residents who do not have legal status, who live day by day with the reality they could be deported, or a family member could be deported for a relatively minor offense. And while the suburban areas of the county are relatively safe, violence is a constant threat within the outer, most remote regions of the county. Thanks to a combination of increased law enforcement presence, a reinforced border fence, and the most modern technology for detecting movement, the perpetrators have been forced to cross outside the inhabited areas. The violence that does occur is mostly confined to criminal acts committed against border crossers themselves. Robbery and rape are common, and dozens die every year after being abandoned by those who promise to lead them to an area well away from the border. Any provision in a bill that addresses this issue would be welcome. Any provision of a bill that ignores this reality would not. While there has been a dramatic decline in crossing by the undocumented aliens looking for work, given the scarcity of jobs during the Great Recession, there are still thousands from Mexico and Central America who are willing to cross into the United States despite this danger. The alternative of trying to scratch a living in Mexico is the worst alternative. Immigration reform must take into account two groups. Those who will come at great cost at their own safety, not because they are necessarily seeking immediate U.S. citizenship, but rather because they are seeking survival for themselves and their families. We must view the presence of local, state, and federal law enforcement like a finger in the dike. To ease on the protection now enjoyed is to open a small crack that would eventually become a flood. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security following the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001 has helped to divert the potential for violence, but there is no cause to relax or cut back. However, merely increasing the number of agents without also addressing the issues outlined earlier would not be of long-term benefit. The fact that the residents of Nogales and Santa Cruz County enjoy a level of safety far above many neighborhoods in Tucson and Phoenix should not be a caveat for reduced enforcement. If anything, it should stand as a role model for what can be achieved when local, state, and federal agencies work together for a common cause. The border remains active, lively, and dynamic. A very thin line separates Santa Cruz County with its population about 45,000 from a very poor, very tenuous metropolitan in Mexico of about 400,000. We in law enforcement have a responsibility to protecting our own residents, visitors to the border area, and even those who cross illegally from predators who know full well that few will complain to law enforcement agencies because doing so will result in their deportation. The bottom line, there is no sealing the border completely. The longer the fence becomes, the more sophisticated the technology, the stronger the law enforcement presence, the greater level of safety for those living near Mexico. Focusing the drug and people smugglers ever outward to more remote areas is both a blessing and a curse. As long as there are those in the U.S. who will purchase drugs, and as long as the economy of Mexico is below the U.S., even with our economic challenges, there will be those who will do whatever it takes to cross. Immigration reform is a must. Congress and the President should work together and put away partisan differences to create a bill that, while not satisfying everyone, can at least address the major inequities in current immigration policy. Protecting the border area has never been, and should never be the sole responsibility of local law enforcement. The isolated incidents of violence against a rancher or even law enforcement personnel may not be justification for keeping up the pressure, Congressman Grijalva, but the alternative is one that would impact every American regardless of where she resides. Any bill needs to include reimbursement to local border area law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, and detention facilities, since they bear an unfair financial burden for past inaction on immigration reform. And I want to thank you again for giving me the responsibility and hopefully giving a different aspect about the situation we have here in Santa Cruz County. I continue to endorse and claim that we have one of the safest communities. So one of the things I did want to mention, and you are addressing this now, is that every border community, every border county has a different level of threat. And I think those are the things that have to be addressed. While we may not have it here, because we have a 1,000 Border Patrol agents, a lot of law enforcement presence here, there are other areas between San Diego and Brownsville that probably have some major issues that need to be addressed. On the Senate Bill 744, 20,000 additional Border Patrol agents, I think is overkill. I think what needs to be done is to properly, adequately fund the agents that you have now in order to do the job. And we partner well with Border Patrol and our state partners as well. And we understand that the new immigration is a phenomenon that is very complex and is going to require a lot of thought and hopefully agreement among the parties involved. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you for that. You know, you're in Congress, you're on the floor and ready to vote, and we invariably, as members of Congress, talk to each other. And I get this all the time. The members will come up and say, "Hey, what's with your sheriff or title?" And I would say, no, his name's Estrada. I was grateful for that opportunity too. I'm going to ask my colleagues to ask questions, make comments of our witnesses, kind of concentrating on the people that spoke. We've had some people who, our time is getting really constrained, that have asked to make a brief minute, 2-minute comments to myself and my colleagues, and we'll certainly afford as many as we can the opportunity before the witching hour hits us. But with that, let me turn to Congressman Vela, if you have any questions or comments for any of the people that provided testimony today.
Well, I think what I would like to do is actually put the immigration reform process in Congress in perspective, because I don't think we got a chance to do that yet. Because we've talked about Senate Bill 744, which essentially provided for a 13-year pathway to citizenship, but which of course had the border search provisions, which many of us believe are extreme, which we know as the Corker-Hogan Amendment. But to be fair, it wasn't just Corker and Hogan. Senator Schumer was complicit bringing that forward, and I think it's very mindful. It's very important to be mindful of the fact that there were a lot of other folks that were supportive of those measures that we wouldn't think would have been supportive. Simultaneously, since Congressman O'Rourke and I got to Congress, there's been a gang of, they call it the gang, it was a gang of 8 when we got there. It's whittled down to the gang of 7 here over the last few months, which is a bipartisan group of members, including Congressman Johnson and Carter from Texas, P.S. Ballard from Miami, and Democratic Congressman Gutierrez Becerra, Loughran, and Yarmouth. And pretty much every week, every month, every week that has gone by since January, we have been expecting them to produce something that we could look at. Coming into after the August recess, we were pretty confident that we would be seeing a measure, a proposed measure from the Gang of 7, but then of course Syria hit. We're headed to our, we've got 2 more weeks, 3 more weeks this month with a recess that's being canceled because of the debt ceiling and the government funding issues. So who knows whether or not we're going to see a provision from the Gang of 7. Who knows what's in there, because for good reasons probably they've kept negotiations with themselves. They've worked real hard on it. There's no question about that. I've spoken and have respect for all 7 of those, but are we going to see something? We just don't know. And we're there with them every day when we're in the session. And then of course you have the Republican Judiciary Committee that has decided to take a piecemeal approach. And I've had the benefit of speaking to another member of Congress from Oregon who I talk to a lot, Congresswoman Del Benny. And just as an example, the Dreamer Act legislation that was proposed piecemeal, and I don't know how far it's gotten in that committee yet. She said it was just really a non-starter. So we have the piecemeal process coming out of the Judiciary Committee as well. Where that goes, we don't know. And so we're waiting. We're 3 months away from the end of the year, with a primary election cycles beginning in March, and we're really nowhere different today. In fact, in my view, we're in a worse place given the fact that the Senate passed provisions as extremist supporters than we were before them. But that's the status of immigration reform as we see it now, as it currently sits.
Mr. Wright. First, I want to thank the panel. I guess I should thank you for bringing the panel together. I think you've set the bar very high for the session that we're going to have in El Paso on Monday. As I said earlier, I'm fired up on these issues already, and that's why I wanted to run for Congress in the first place. And what I've heard today has only intensified that, and makes me want to redouble our efforts in the House that Congressman Vela is talking about. You hit everything from the human element to the constitutional element to the broader economic to the environmental, regional economics to the law enforcement. And I think you've given us a lot more information and ammunition to use on our colleagues in Congress to try to persuade them to do the right thing. And there's, I was reading about this, I guess it's kind of an apocryphal story about President Roosevelt, FDR, when approached by civil rights leaders who made their case about improving civil rights laws in this country. He said at the end of the session, "You're right, now make me do something about it." And I think what he was trying to say is you need to build the political coalitions to allow this kind of change that you're talking about to occur. And what our challenge is, and we're going to need your help, and Allison and I got a chance to talk about this today, is we need to find those people up north who are our natural allies, the people in Michigan who depend on this $500 billion in U.S.-Mexico trade every year for the jobs in their districts. Environmental communities in other parts of North America who may not know what's happening here at the U.S.-Mexico border. Because the arguments you're making, and I said this to Allison also, they're far too logical and rational. You got to remember you're dealing with Congress. We're going to need to have a really special strategy to be effective. Because the moral arguments, I'm there, and that's what drives me. Congressman Grijalva has been incredibly eloquent on this point. You had record low northbound crossing attempts. Net migration from Mexico last year was 0. And yet you have the second highest number of migrant crossing deaths on the books. Something's desperately wrong right now. And to think that as a country we've spent $46 billion to build 700 more miles of walls, to double the Border Patrol with another 20,000 agents, to hire all of these defense and homeland security contractors to further militarize our border and push these migrants into even more hostile and dangerous parts of the desert is unconscionable. And yet that's exactly what passed the Senate by almost a supermajority vote. These people who voted for it are not malicious, they're not mean-spirited, they just don't understand it and know the border. And there's a reason that Corker is from Tennessee and Hogan is from North Dakota. They don't live here, they don't understand it. And that's on us, all of us. We need to find these allies up north, make allies up north. And one of the issues that I've been passionate about related to the border, and the sheriff knows all about this, you all know all about this, in the 5 preceding years, more than 10,000 people have been murdered in our sister city of Ciudad Juarez in the most brutal, horrific, terroristic fashion possible. And despite the moral imperative to do something, I have to, if I had to measure it in the U.S. Congress, they could care less. Those people are bad people doing bad things. They deserve it. That's the conventional wisdom. We know otherwise, but that's what people say about migrants crossing the border. If they don't want to die, they shouldn't be crossing. They're breaking the law. They had it coming to them. It's awful to say, it's awful to hear, but that's the prevailing sentiment. So I don't know that we can prevail upon the conscience of Congress. What we can do, I think, that's a much more effective route is to talk about the economic self-interest of those districts that we heard from Mr. Wilson and Ms. Moore. People respond to their constituents who want jobs, who care about their own economic self-interest, and I think that is perhaps going to be the most effective route to get there. Now, I wanted to give a real quick update along with what Congressman Vela mentioned. We have introduced a bill to help the migrant children who are in our foster care system. All too often, many of them, when they reach the age of 18, are tragically sent back to their countries of origin where they may not know the language. They may face the person who abused them or neglected them in the first place. We have some Republican co-sponsors. I'm hopeful that's going to pass. This next week, and I'm going to have the help, I think, of my colleagues here, we're going to introduce a bill to allow judges discretion when they're ruling on lifetime bans of the family members of U.S. citizens. I attended a wedding on the Paso Norte Bridge that connects Juarez and El Paso 2 weeks ago. Edgar Falcon and his wife, his fiancée, Mari Cruz from Durango. Mari Cruz had a lifetime ban of reentry because when she was a child, her sister falsely claimed citizenship for her. And for that, she can never enter the country again, ever. And there's no discretion that any judge can use to change that. Our bill would allow for that, and again, we hope to have bipartisan support. But really, that's working at the margins. We obviously all agree we need something more comprehensive, and so we'll continue to work on that. Some questions for Mr. Lyle. A lot of people have interpreted Supreme Court rulings to mean that the Constitution is suspended at the U.S.-Mexico border. Whether it's at the border, 25 miles of the border, 100 miles of the border. We get these cases in our office all of the time. There was a great New York Times article this last week about the suspension of the Fourth Amendment at the border. The amendment is supposed to protect us against unwarranted search and seizure. What is your advice to us as members of Congress who hear those cases, to the citizens who are crossing when they feel that they're abused, treated less than humanely, have their rights violated. We often tell them, you need to ask for a supervisor when you're crossing. And the response I get is, I waited for 3 hours in 100-degree heat to cross into the U.S. Do you think that I want to now sit in a supervisor's office and file a complaint that's going to go nowhere? I just want to get to my job or do my shopping or go to school. What's a better way for us to handle it? What's a better way for the crosser to handle it?
Well, it's a great question, Congressman, and we frequently refer to this zone of authority of CBP as the Constitution-free zone, and it's sort of a shorthand for an area where CBP has extra authority to enforce the immigration law. But it's not literally a Constitution-free zone. There are very much limitations on the authority of Customs and Border Protection officials in different contexts. I think it's pretty clear that and courts have been clear that the authority of CBP is at its greatest at the ports of entry, where they have the most legitimate authority to inspect the people who are coming in to ensure that they have a legitimate claim to entry. And further from the border, as we go up into other situations at checkpoints, in roving patrol stops, encounters on private land, the legal analysis is different and protections afforded to citizens are greater. And so it's not true that it's literally a constitution-free zone. There are still very important Fourth Amendment limitations on the Border Patrol, for example, at checkpoints. They cannot do searches of vehicles without consent or probable cause. They cannot enter into private dwellings without a warrant. They can't go onto private land north of 25 miles. There are a number of limitations. One of the problems is that Border Patrol and CBP officials do not always have a clear sense themselves of where their authority ends in all of these situations. And part of that is an issue of training. Part of that is an issue of oversight and accountability. That may be the biggest issue is as the people who contact you who want to file a complaint or speak to a supervisor, they express frustration that this complaint is going to go nowhere. Well, part of that is because there aren't internal mechanisms that should be in place for adequate oversight and accountability, including training, including transparency.
When you say transparency, is that asking CBP El Paso sector, or in this case Tucson sector, I want you to publish the number of complaints and how they were resolved? Is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely, yeah. Producing information on the number of complaints, the type of complaints, what happens with them. It's very difficult to know how CBP handles internal disciplinary matters. And the transparency also extends to just how someone can file a complaint, how they can follow it, and what's happening with their complaint. One of the individuals I mentioned, Clarissa Christensen, filed a complaint because there was this experience where she was a single mother of two who was pulled over nowhere near the border and subjected to really extreme mistreatment, including property destruction. All she wanted was that they replace her flat tire that they destroyed. Mm-hmm. And they gave her the runaround. She spoke to multiple officials. Nobody was clear on what she could file, who she should talk to. She was bounced around to different officials. Ultimately, after we got involved, she was essentially sent a Federal Tort Claims Act sheet and essentially told, go ahead and sue us if you want. And essentially, she was seeking $50 for the replacement of a tire and I think a well-deserved apology. But even in that situation, she couldn't get a clear answer on where her complaint was going. And so that's the kind of transparency issue that is a common problem and discourages more people from coming forward. Other people don't come forward because they're afraid of retaliation. I've spoken to ranchers and people who generally aren't afraid of anything, who have expressed a great reluctance to come forward and speak out about problems they're having on their own property or in their communities. This is the largest law enforcement agency in the country claiming extra constitutional authorities. Shouldn't they have the kinds of internal mechanisms for oversight, accountability, transparency that we've come to expect from other much smaller law enforcement agencies that don't claim that kind of authority?
It's an excellent point, and I realize that I've got questions for everyone, but I don't want to consume all the time. And so I may follow up, if there's not time today for a second round of questions, I may follow up with some of the individual panels. Let me just say this though, I will work with our co-chairs of the Board of Caucus. We have 5 scheduled working days left before the end of the fiscal year, and we haven't passed a budget, a continuing resolution to fund the government. We have a debt ceiling crisis, everything that you've heard about. Congress is dysfunctional, it doesn't work. We are in the minority, but we are in the same party as our president, and I think there may be some administrative cures to some of the things that you brought up. So we've written down, I wrote down the list of suggestions that you made, that Father Carroll made, and others. I think it might make sense for the Border Caucus to write those up and ask for administrative concessions. You know, this one on transparency, how hard can that be to do? They must be reporting those numbers anyhow. Let's publish them and get them out in the community. Don't make us legislate the fix. So maybe that's a place to start with some of these. And with that, I'll yield back to the chair.
Mr. Rourke, that's a good point. And the written testimony and the verbal testimony are going to be part of the record that I'll be submitting for congressional record. But I think the testimony that we received from all our witnesses, we need to work with our staff, tear it down, and present to both the administration and those that could be converted into discussions about the current bill that's before us as well. There's the economic issue, there's the humanitarian issue, and then there's the functioning issue, how Border Patrol functions, how the policy of the border functions, and how we can mitigate that so that citizens have the right to know, as we do in every other instance. And now it's the biggest federal law enforcement agency in the country, and as such, I think it's mature enough now to be able to deal with transparency and reporting. 4 years ago, well, we're too new, just getting developed, we can't deal with that. Well, I think that time's passed now, after a decade plus, and it's time. A very general question for James and Chris. Root causes. We never have this discussion when we talk about immigration. So, the migration coming north, the issues of trade policies, other economic policies, our own labor policies, how that affects, and our whole visa quotas that we have established that are more arbitrary than really reflect need. That isn't part of the immigration debate, but I think it's a huge point on how we end up where we are in terms of both migration and the harshness of the policies that we see trying to deal with that huge migration. And any reaction from any of you on that? We feel like we need to integrate that, but I don't think it's going to be done instead.
I mean, I could thank you for asking. I mean, that's a fantastic point. When you have a problem, usually you want to see what is the root cause of that problem. And if the perception is we have a problem of unauthorized immigration to the U.S., you would think there'd be a little more attention to investigating why are people coming. People don't want to leave their home. Nobody wants to leave their country, their home, their family, and go somewhere that they're unfamiliar with. It's a painful, difficult, extremely dangerous journey, even getting to the border. But you're right, Congressman, this is not part of the debate at all. And I think it behooves all of us when we're talking about immigration reform and immigration policy to consider how does free trade and regional trade policy impact migration flows? How has NAFTA impacted farmers in Mexico? How has our involvement in Central America in the past and currently impacted the situation there? I mean, we have record numbers of Central American unaccompanied children fleeing the region, coming to the border. They're not doing it, just to game the system. They're doing it out of desperation and for survival. And so what can we look at in our foreign policies that are going to engage these issues and have an impact, rather than just focusing on the border and punishing people, rather than, again, recognizing the root cause of migration? It's something that isn't done and needs to be done.
Anybody else who wants to comment? That's part of those who deal with it.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. I think the starting point Oftentimes we sort of look backwards and want to have a discussion of NAFTA and what some of the pros and cons were, and there's plenty of space for a discussion like that. I think the reality today is that because of the fact that we're neighbors, because of NAFTA, because of other factors, we now have an economy that's very tightly integrated between the United States and Mexico, and Canada for that matter. And really the way to look forward is to ask the question, what can we all do to boost our regional economies together? Because those are the kinds of things that are going to change the dynamics over the long term of immigration. If economic factors are the root causes of migration, that are the main one at least, then I think that we can have a discussion about how the United States and Mexico can act as partners on the global stage to boost the economy of both sides of the border, so that there's growth in Mexico, so that there's growth in the United States. And part of that discussion has to do with exactly what we're talking about today, how you manage the border. At one point in time, the tariff barriers between the United States and Mexico were probably the biggest thing impeding the flow of commerce between the two countries. That's no longer the case. There's very few tariff barriers between the two countries. What we have right now are long lines at the border, complicated customs forms that need to be filled out. We have non-tariff barriers that are impeding the movement of goods and people across the border. So those are the things we need to focus on now. And it really puts border issues at the center of this discussion of how we can make the region's economy more competitive, and the impact that would have on immigration in the long term, not necessarily in the short term, but in the long term is very important.
Yes. What we've seen in our work with migrants is that the biggest motive for crossing the border is economic necessity. That second is family reunification, and the third would be violence, generalized violence, particularly in Central America. And so I think part of this analysis as well, James and Chris are alluding to this, is looking at, well, where more specifically in Mexico and in Central America are these causes and these realities particularly acute? Because I think that will be important in terms of developing policies to respond. So for example, the majority of migrants we see deported and are Mexican are from southern Mexico. So Oaxaca, Chiapas, Puebla, Guerrero. There's violence, but a lot of it is economic necessity. And so the question is, well, why is that? Why is there such economic need in that particular region of Mexico? Not that it doesn't exist in other areas, but I'd say the majority of people we serve are from there. And so how can our policies and our analysis and policies respond to that reality? Obviously that means working with the Mexican government, but I think that's an important part of the analysis as well.
Very good. Anyone else? I was going to ask Ms. Allen, and this has been an issue that's been a bane in my side, the whole waiver, and in talking to good conservationists and preservationists of cultural and historic sites and all that, the tendency is to say this is an issue that involves so much of a human element that our issue doesn't seem strong enough to be in the discussion. I disagree, and I thought your testimony spoke well to that. So, in making this an important part of the discussion, which is the whole point, that those 37 laws and others, and what impact it's going to have, because it's federal land, public land. There's going to be an interesting test when you go into tribal land and to ask a sovereign nation to build a fence or do what you want it to do. That is going to be an interesting legal test. And it's going to be an interesting when you do a taking an eminent domain on a private land, which really hasn't occurred yet. And in the Nogales border, it's been relatively seamless for Homeland Security because they're dealing with federal land, and that's what the legislation addressed. So how do we make it so that people understand that this is not just a petty issue, that it is a very much fundamental deals with the border? Testimony, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think there's a number of kind of important angles, and I think particularly for the Border Caucus, to think about why we have to push back on the use of waivers, and because their impact to parks, national parks, state parks, city parks. Most of the border districts are predominantly Latino. Latino families value and utilize parks, recreation activities outside more than any other ethnic group. It's an issue that resonates very strongly within our communities. We want to have places where we can go outside, enjoy our time with our families, but the waivers, they essentially erode those places that are special to us. They enable us not to be able to enjoy them as they should be in all of their diversity and their richness. I think that there's a piece that's, I think, useful within border communities and border caucus to think about sort of our constituents, or your constituents, us as the constituents, really wanting to have these important places protected and not subject to kind of whatever DHS wants to do within building roads and walls and other activities through them. That's kind of a compelling piece. The other is that I think the argument around waivers is also to be rooted around rule of law. I mean, we hear this all the time within a context of immigration about, we have laws, we need to enforce them. Please, let's do that within the border region as well. We have the Clean Air Act, let's uphold it. We have the Clean Water Act, let's keep it strong within the border region. These are important for our communities on a health basis, on preserving the integrity of our parks and our lands, but it's also just an important value as a nation that we have to stand behind and uphold.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up to that real quickly. In your written statement, you mentioned that instead of repealing or narrowing this egregious waiver authority, the proposed legislation actually expands it to include additional infrastructure. Are you talking about the legislation from 2005 or SB 744?
744 expands the current scope of the waiver, applies to barriers and roads. The S744 would expand the scope of when the waiver can be invoked to other sorts of construction and infrastructure activities.
Yeah, we need to take a serious look at that.
Thank you. And I have people that wanted to address us today, and I'm going to get through as many as I can, and forgive me for those I don't get to. We're kind of crunching up on time. We have a press availability for the members after this, and an opportunity to chat with our witnesses, for lack of a better word. But I want to thank you very much. A very intelligent and necessary conversation that we've had with each other, and I appreciate it. Mr. Vela talked about what's going to happen now, and Mr. Rourke talked about the dysfunction and the things that Congress needs to grapple with in its immediacy, and what's going to happen to immigration reform in the full sense of the word. I really believe, and Mr. Rourke talked about two pieces of legislation that are absolutely necessary and good, and we're going to support them and hope to move them along. But as we go forward, I really don't see the House coming up with the Gang of Seven piece of legislation. I see that as a standstill, if not stalled. I think the members of the Democrats involved have kind of signed off on stuff that maybe isn't probably a little worse than what's in the Senate bill in some areas, but with the righteous intention of moving this to conference and seeing if something better would come out. Well, that vehicle is slowly coming to a standstill, and so that leaves what? It leaves horrendous SAFE Act, other stuff that is coming out of the judiciary, which are really bad pieces of legislation that almost all of us that are here present, and many others are just out of instinct are going to oppose. And which one of them could be a vehicle for a conference? I don't know. Is it the E-Verify bill? Is it the McCall bill? Which one is going to grab? And that's actually, I agree with Mr. Vela, that's not actually, compared to what's in the Senate bill, not that bad of an issue. Of a little, I think it over triggers things, but that's another discussion. And then there's the renewed discussion about a discharge petition, that's when a majority, 219 members of Congress, sign a petition, then that piece of legislation would automatically go to the floor for a vote. That's being renewed as a strategy to try to force Boehner and the leadership to let us have a vote on it. So, and then that would become the vehicle for conference. But it would be identical to the Senate bill, so it wouldn't be much vehicle. You're kind of agreeing to it. And like I said, there's concerns that we have in the content of that Senate bill that we would like to see changed if indeed that's going to be the vehicle. So with that in mind, we're going to discuss, as those of us here plus others, a very important placeholder that can be our vehicle for discussion and to interject ourselves strongly into what is going to be the content of a discharge bill and what are the things that we see need to be changed. And obviously the legislation we would be looking at is legislation that has been filed previously with changes to reflect the new reality and with additions around humanitarian issues that wasn't there, and additions on judicial discretion, additions on shortcutting some of the streamlining that's going on in court, transparency issues that you brought up, and those are some of the tweaks, and plus full cost recovery for local communities, whether it is first responders of any kind, housing, and the prosecution side of the question, and more emphasis on the economic issue. Well, what that would do for us is to define security in a different way. It would define security from the way it's being defined now to a much more economic security, human security, and legal security, for lack of a better word. So taking the word security and making it a full definition of a word. We're going to explore that. We think we need a placeholder. We think there's many members of Congress that are kind of twisting in the wind, understanding the human imperative of getting something done, but also having trouble swallowing some poison pills. And hopefully we provide a place that if we have enough members signing along from a position of strength, we can go and say we need these changes made in any bill that becomes part of a discharge petition. Because I think now that's looking more like the vehicle than a standalone bill down the road. With that, let me ask, and thank you so much, all of you. We appreciate talking with you afterwards. My two colleagues more than I, but that's okay. They're new, they don't know you well enough. Let me ask from the greater Nogales, and I'm doing it in order as they came in. Let me, let's see. See what happens when you're in Congress and you get as old as I do? You have all these young people telling you what to do constantly. It's not like an assisted living center. You have caregivers all the time. You wouldn't know this, but it'll come. Let me, and you either, really. We're going to ask about 3 or 4 people. That's what Christina said we'd have time. And we'll do, there's a press conference at the old courthouse, right? And if I could, I've got 1, 2, 3, a ver cómo sale. Let me start backwards. And there's some good people that asked, to talk about, from Louisville's keynote team, and then talk about immigration reform. They're at the bottom of the list. So those individuals, I'll probably just call one. There's about 6 here. So I'll let you let somebody. Let me ask Jaime Chamberlain from the Fresh Produce Association. He asked for a couple of quick comments, and I appreciate it, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Grijalva, Congressman O'Rourke. Thank you very much, Congressman Vela. Appreciate your time. Greatest day of my life I spent in El Paso when we crossed my adopted son into the United States, so the bridges of America 7 years ago. So
Right.
it was the greatest day of my life in your community. I'd like to start off just a little bit of information, Congressman. I just came back yesterday from a trade mission with the Arizona legislature to Mexico City. It started off being a trade mission and ended up being an immigration mission. So we really didn't expect that. That was led by the Arizona House of Representatives, Andy Tobin, and with a series of both Republican and Democratic legislatures that went on a fact-finding mission to Mexico City. Also, the president of the Arizona Chamber of Commerce was with us, and a representative from the Arizona Dairymen's Association, and also from Honeywell. It was an extremely eye-opening experience for myself. It was a little bit different than the other trade missions that I had gone with the Fresh Produce Association and with the Port Authority. I think the House of Representatives in Mexico City and the Senate in Mexico City were extremely interested in our participation and also in our interest in going to Mexico City, despite, especially with the last few years in Arizona and how the immigration issue has changed our political and our economic climate in the state of Arizona. Some of the topics that we talked about were the economic partnerships and economic opportunities we had, the transportation issues that we have on Highway 15 on the Mexican highway, the VICAM protest on that federal highway, also the new Interstate 11 from Arizona to Las Vegas and hopefully to Calgary. We also talked a lot about the Trans-Asian Pacific partnerships. We talked about education. There's interesting theories there of trying to bring 100,000 Mexican students into the United States and also 100,000 U.S. students into Mexico and have them be very mobile throughout the university systems in Mexico and in the United States. We also talked about how our definitions were of border security, and it all came back to if we don't have an economically secure border, we have no border security as it is defined in Washington at this moment. It is increasingly important for all of you and for the business community to get whatever decisions you make on immigration reform right. You have spoken about how you may take some pieces of some legislation and put them together with other ones. It is my duty to tell you that on the Mexican side, and the Mexican government is extremely interested in how this all plays out, because ultimately it will affect the economic stability of both the United States and Mexico, and the economic partnership between the both countries. I think that some of the issues that we have between Border Patrol and Customs, whether there should be more funding or less funding for either agencies, are extremely important. Obviously, in the business community, for us, it is extremely important that our staffs are funded correctly with agents, the correct amount of agents, and also with the correct amount of technology that we need to be successful. You have the business community that is looking toward you to see what our next steps are for our growth, and your decisions are very important to our growth and to what we do in the future. One of the other issues I wanted to bring up quickly is just the way Border Patrol is congressionally funded by direct appropriation, and how Customs is a mixture of direct appropriations and their user fees. And when you come to our border communities that have lost the crossings that we've lost in the last 5 to 7 years, it's difficult to justify user fees when we have lower crossings. Therefore, Customs eventually has lower funding available. So I just wanted to let you know that despite the wave of the reforms in the Mexican government right now, with their educational reforms and with their IRS reforms, it is extremely important that for them, how we treat the immigration issue. As I said before, the immigration issue is a direct effect of how our two countries and the relationship of our two countries will continue from now forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tammy, you have to tell me, for my own curiosity, how some of the delegation who remain nameless, okay, it's not a question, it's more of a comment, including the speaker, who have been consistently voting on some of the harshest immigration laws in the state, how they reacted to that question.
I think for them it was a little bit of a surprise, but I think they expected some sort of some negative comments. It's incredible how everyone knows Sheriff Arpaio, somewhat even a little bit more than the name of the governor. But as far as how they reacted, I think they reacted very openly, very honestly. They understood that some mistakes have been made in the state of Arizona, and they were there really to mend fences and to build partnerships and to tell them that the state of Arizona is open for business. And they have a relatively brand new legislative body there, very young, like yourselves. And
thank you for that.
Those people, very young like yourselves, and I think they understand that that the state of Arizona can no longer suffer through the economic downturns that we had since the mistakes that we've made.
Very good, thank you. I look forward to seeing a speaker in one of the neighborhoods in Tucson that had the same attitude that some of the legislators in Mexico have. Let me ask, where are you? Mr. Brecker, please, Port Authority.
Oh, Lieutenant, did you want to?
Yeah, and then I've got the young man that has been selected from Nogales Catholic School, teens, is Mr. Jesus Espinosa. After this gentleman, you can speak.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming to the city of Nogales and holding these hearings along the U.S.-Mexican border. These are very important for our economy and very important for our country. Nogales is a gateway for some $20 billion worth of goods that are shipped between the U.S. and Mexico. In 2012, Nogales ports of entry crossed some 615,000 trucks, 1,300 trains, 17.6 million people, and 5.4 million cars. And all these numbers are expected to go up in 2013. In fact, this may not sound like a lot, but it translates into more than 1 million people additional crossing in 2013. Excuse me. This is critical to our community, as it's estimated that some 60% of our sales tax revenue derives from Mexican visitors. Simply stated, as more people cross the border, our sales tax revenues increase. For those of us on the border who understand that the number one reason people cross the border or don't cross the border is wait times. It sounds simple, but border wait times are impacted by a number of critical factors, including infrastructure, technology, inspection procedures, coordination with Mexico staffing, and the ports of entry. Allow me to focus later on staffing. We are underway at a $220 million improvement of our port of entry in Mariposa. It will be the largest gateway for Mexican in the state of Arizona. We're going to go from 4 car lanes to 12 car lanes at Mariposa. We're going from 4 truck lanes to 8 truck lanes, and we're adding a dedicated bus lane to the facilities to handle, and also handling pedestrians in both directions. In addition, this is going to be the first port of entry that will have a dedicated southbound inspection lanes, greatly enhancing the effort to prevent money laundering, weapon smuggling, and a myriad of other illegal activities into Mexico. We're working with our partners in Mexico to ensure that the adequate expansions of the infrastructure on the Mexican side of the border as well, to ensure that we're not moving the bottleneck from our side of the border to theirs. The reconfigure process will be complete in 2014. Our biggest fear is that this state-of-the-art facility will only be able to operate partially. Our ports of entry are understaffed today. By some estimates, 250 customs officers. That does not include the additional capacity coming online. Considering that it takes 18 months to train a customs officer, it is imperative that we move on hiring these additional customs officers immediately. Border wait times translate into competitiveness. When people and companies have a choice of where they can locate along the U.S.-Mexican border, or even if people just have to cross the border, to do so in an effective manner is critical. Okay. There's no greater evidence of this than the luncheon that was held by the City of FAR in our community last week. Representatives of FAR were selling infrastructure, technology, coordinating and staffing of their ports of entry as reasons why Nogales companies should move to FAR.
Sorry.
While competition is fair, it's not fair for the federal government to put ports of entry like Nogales in Arizona at a disadvantage to what's going on in Texas. And Congressman Grijalva and Congressman O'Rourke and Congressman Vela, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Espinosa? Do you want to introduce your colleagues, students that are here? Because they all asked to speak and you're the only one we have time for.
Well, I have my teacher, Ms. Scully. She's my theology teacher, and she's our director at the School of the Kino Teens.
Okay.
And Mr. Father Sean Carroll is like our director as well, and on behalf of the KBI, the Kino Border Initiative. And my schoolmates, there's Nicole Davison, Carolina Silok, and Jerry Perez.
Thank you.
You're probably wondering what a 17-year-old kid is doing here, but
No, I'm very impressed.
But it's an honor to be here and represent the Kino Teens, and touch on the humanitarian aspect of the border issues, and what I'd like to say is, like how Mr. O'Rourke said, how people are not familiar of the ways of living here, and they're not familiar with the way we see our day-to-day life, and how we speak two languages and live in two cultures and live in two countries at the same time, and how what we see in the shelter and at the comedor, as we call it, for the migrants, is that these people are not what most people look at them like. They're not the stereotypical aspect of they're not the point of view most people have on them. The migrants are just people like everyone here, you and me, and most depictions of them are drug lords or criminals or vandalists, and it's not really like that. It's just such a personal aspect you have with them when you go to this place. And I think that's what most people don't know, that these people suffer through so many things, to the point where they might even reach death, to search for a better life, and you get to hear their stories, and it's so rewarding to have that kind of experience, and it really gets to you, and on that humanitarian side, it really touches your heart, and I guess some recommendations on my behalf and the teams would be that so some improvements, whether how hard they might be or how long it might take for them to occur, is that to help these people, because what I have seen personally is that if you've interacted with one of them, is that it's so personal. They tell you everything, and they let you know what they feel and what they think, and you can tell right away that they are not the stereotypical point of view on them. You know, they're not criminals. They're just looking for a better life, and I guess what I would want to happen is some change that, you know, improves their lives and makes it easier for them to be welcomed into this country, and, you know, to not have to struggle through the hardships of you know, having to do it illegally. And you know, some of the migrants actually don't even know Mexico. They came into the country at a very young age, and they speak English. Some of them don't even know the Spanish language, and it's also difficult to see them be torn apart from their families. And you know, if that were to happen to me, I don't know what I would do, because, you know, everyone depends on their families at such a great level, and it's not like they're doing it voluntarily. They're doing it for, you know, a better quality of life. And I guess that's it.
That was very good. Is Mr. Parra here? And let me, as council comes up, let me, my apologies to the other students that put in cards. Time ran out on us. Mr. Dan Mills, my good friend Mr. Delcy, and Kip Martin, and a name I can't read, I apologize. We won't have time for that discussion. Please feel free to, if there's anything you'd like to give us in writing, to get it to our office, and we'll make it part of the record. And with that, let me ask our final call to the audience, Mr. Clara.
My name is Luis Fernando Parra. I'm a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. This past February, the courageous young man standing to my right was greeted by Congressman Grijalva in Washington, D.C. He joined him in jump-starting the decision on reform. Abdiel Gonzalez is a border dreamer. He was brought to the United States as an infant. He's now a recipient of the Deferred Action Childhood Act. He is a graduate of Rio Rico High School. Abdiel married his high school sweetheart earlier this year, which might be in the chamber. She is a United States citizen, but yet Abdiel is unable to adjust status to legal permanent residency on account of our broken immigration system. Currently, he resides in Rio Rico, and he works in Rio Rico, gainfully employed. It is time. It is time to take up permanent legalization of dreamers, such as Abdiel, who hope to join the Air Force and serve his country as soon as he is given the opportunity to do so. It is time to take up family. It's time to take up family unity, so that Abdiel can visit his grandmother, who's dying of cancer in Nogales, Sonora. It's time to take up the legalization sooner rather than later, as currently being considered by Congressman Goodlatte, who seems to want border security to take priority over family reunification. Help Abdiel and Claudia deserve this priority. Help the kids be in the number one position as opposed to the third or fourth position. There's a lot of discussion right now, obviously, about October, November time frame for this reform to really take hold. The discussion is that they'll take up border security first. At least that's what we're hearing through the American Immigration Lawyers Association listserv. And perhaps that might be the case. But if that is the case, please do your part, and I know you will, Congressman, in putting family reunification
at the top of the totem pole as much as possible. Thank you, Congressman, for your leadership in the immigration reform effort.
If I can, Council, let me ask you a quick question. One of the discussions around the inclusion of the DREAM Act and codifying all that the president is trying to do with his executive order, which version is better, kind of a discussion. A lot of comment about, we've talked about a lot about S744, but we've heard from people that section in there has got the broadest application down the road. Do you feel that way, or do you have an opinion on that?
Quite frankly, Congressman, and this was the word in San Francisco this past summer in the ALE conference, whatever it takes.
Okay.
Thank you, Congressman.
Any comments? Any words?
Well, I just want to say thank you for everybody that's here. I know everybody's doing their part. I know everybody's working hard. Everybody wants change. Change is good. It's scary, but it is good. And I'm just normal, not a citizen yet, but I'm a normal resident. I work hard just like everybody else in here. I tried going to school, but it's not impossible, but it was really hard in my case. So now I'm working full time, and my dream was to join the service. It's always been my dream, but quite frankly, I can't do that right now. But I know that one day I will, and I'll serve everybody in here, in this room. And I just want to thank everybody here, and keep fighting for everybody else that's out there like me.
It's good to see you again.